I did not expect that last video to be as popular as it was. Thank you. I'm really happy that people are as interested in that kind of stuff as I am. The next video I think is going to be super interesting because I'm working with somebody from the community and we're tweaking some things. The Boxer radio, I've been having these magnets, but this video is about something very different. It is about the donut prop. And this is the donut prop from Foxeer. Thank you so much to Foxeer for making this propeller. It is the first propeller of this design. And if you're unaware, I'm gonna give you a real quick synopsis. This propeller design, it was popularized. Didn't come from MIT, it was popularized by MIT in a paper that they presented, in my opinion, far too prematurely. And they overhyped the potential benefits in a manner that is to the level of snake oil. And in my opinion, I think that it was very poorly done and it doesn't stand for what MIT actually stands for. There's actually a lot of knowledge, information, and research coming out of MIT. So it's such a fantastic source of everything. I very much appreciate that they presented this because it really invigorated the industry and just people's interest in props and the overall designs and just everything. So thank you so much, but I wish it wasn't presented in such a manner that it caused such a ridiculous amount of hype. This blade, this design, it actually does not share a whole lot in common with that design that MIT presented. A lot of people have printed all sorts of shapes and circles and whatevers, and primarily in the circle shape, not the oval shape that they made. I think it's because it's just more difficult to design, but people have had varying levels of success with the circular design and various printed props. I don't really care for printed props because they never fly anything close to the real thing that's made of plastic and the correct amount of material with the correct weight and all the correct designs. So I didn't even bother with it. However, I did discuss the design with prop manufacturers and we all kind of got together and talked about it a whole lot. And we all kind of had similar ideas. We're flying performance crafts. We're not flying like slow planes. Maybe on a plane, this sort of a shape might work out better, but like the circular shape might work better because it's like always in forward motion. The propeller is, square to the direction of travel. But for our purposes, it doesn't really work out that great. That's why the propeller that you're looking at doesn't look like the propeller that MIT originally showed, and it doesn't really share a whole lot in common. The only thing it really does share in common is this concept of connecting the blade tips such that it shares a vortex trail coming off the blade tip. When you look at a propeller, as it spins, air flows down its blade, washes out from the blade, and then you get a vortex coming off the blade tip, which is very draggy, causes a lot of drag, makes it much more difficult for the blade to spin through the air. If we can get rid of that vortex, we can manage it in many ways. But if we could just get rid of it or at least cut it in half by sharing it with another blade tip, we could potentially see some significant gains from just getting that kind of convenience of sharing the load. And that's the kind of concept and idea behind this blade. And that's the only thing that is remotely shared with the MIT design. Otherwise, I would not call this a tutorial prop because they're like, look at the blade tip. Like, look at that. There's no propeller to it. There's no shape to it. It's just a connection between the blade ends. And I have some really interesting thoughts about it, but I'll tell you that at the end when I tell you about the kind of progression of where this blade might go. So first and foremost, let's talk about the noise, because everybody is so interested in the noise, which I think is the most insignificant. On the noise front, I would say that it is not quieter. However, it does have a different noise profile. It has a broader noise profile. It might be perceived as more pleasant of a noise to hear than a tri-blade because it doesn't have that high pitch just zing to it. Otherwise, it's the same amount of noise and it doesn't really matter at all. Now that we're past that, I will say that everybody that has a 5-inch quad should pick up at least 2 sets of these blades. And I say 2 sets of these blades because the durability is zilch. It basically sucks for durability. But it is the most interesting propeller that has hit our industry ever. So I would strongly recommend everybody pick up 2 sets. It's worth it. Definitely worth it. No matter what your opinion is, no matter what your ideas are, it is worth your time and the couple bucks it is to give it a try because it is fun. However, the durability is terrible, and that's why you should pick up 2. So this is what happened when I came out of a dive and I gave it a little bit too much throttle and I just touched a branch. I had all four, every single one just go out. They only sent me 2 sets of these blades. So the 1 set was done from 10 seconds of flight. So that was unfortunate, but now you can see that there is no durability at all. They're not going to be using this blade for racing. It doesn't mean it's not going to improve, and these are prototype blades, so the final production blade will be more durable, but it's not going to be like night and day. It's just going to be a bit more durable. So moving on, let's take a look at the actual blade shape because I think it's super interesting and super pretty. So just look at the blade shape. The way they designed this blade is very, very pretty. Like, look how the back blade sits a little bit higher than the front blade. It's such a pretty looking blade to me. They really did such a pretty job on the blade. And like, realistically, I gave them a lot of input and recommendations, but I didn't expect them to take all of it. A lot of my recommendations were taken, which is not always a good thing, as I know. I don't always give the best recommendations, but I think we all had similar ideas. All the engineers kind of had similar ideas, and I think the overall blade shape and the design and what they got for a first product is pretty darn good, and I really commend them for that because it could have gone amiss very badly. This propeller is actually usable. It's not total garbage. It is definitely usable. In fact, there might be a couple people out there that prefer this blade over most other blades that are out there. But now let's take a look at the actual profile of the blade. So I'm going to line this up so that you are only looking at this front blade here and comparing it to the 51433. So by the way, the 51433 is my preferred blade in this industry. It is by far my favorite blade, but there's a lot of blades that I like. I like the F4, I like the F3, I like a lot of them, but nothing feels quite like the right balance that this one does. The balance of response and efficiency and speed and overall just feel in the air. Just the 51433 is my preferred blade still to this date. And looking at this, it's really hard for me to align this perfectly, but that's about right. And you can see that the donut prop is actually more aggressive than the 51433, kind of all the way out to the tip until that bend. And the reason why it looks shorter is because I have it held at this angle. If I kind of bring it together, they are about the same. It is about 5.1 inches. And so the reason why I'm showing you this is because you essentially have a more aggressive blade than the 51433 times 4. You have 4 blades here. And that makes it a very powerful blade. Very, very powerful blade. And that is, in my opinion, not good for most of our crafts because we're used to flying, I think 1750 kV is about the lowest kV that pretty much anyone flies on 6S. And the more common kV is around 1890 or 1900, around that range, which is too high for this blade. Very, very high for this blade. This blade is going to be best on probably 1700 kV and below for 6S, and about 2050 kV, maybe 2100 kV max for 4S, but really 2000 kV for 4S is going to be ideal for this blade shape. And on that note, I would say that I can't really mention too much about the efficiency because I don't know. I don't have a quad that has motors that low of a kV. Actually, I just realized I could just fly this quad on 4S. That's too bad. I don't have a 4S battery too. I can't comment on that, but I can say that this propeller with its 4 blades that are more aggressive than this tri-blade is not a whole lot less efficient than the tri-blade, which is really impressive. And it means that the design, or maybe these ends, are doing something. It's not nothing. It's not totally snake oil. Moving on to the response, this is a 4.25 gram blade. This is a 3.75 gram blade. The weight is not quite as important as the amount of blade that you're pushing through the air, but I will also say that because the weights are kind of similar, durability is impacted because there's not a whole lot more plastic in this one than there is on this one. But the response of this blade is much less, and it's not a whole lot less, but it's definitely less than both a tri-blade and a quad blade. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later at the end in my kind of future developments of this blade, but it's less responsive than both a tri-blade and a quad blade. It's not bad at all, but you just have to note that, and it'll be interesting when I talk about the concept at the very end. The speed of this blade is higher than any quad blade I have ever flown. Any 5-inch quad blade I've ever flown, the speed of this blade is higher. In fact, it's higher than this 51433. I don't have any race blades to compare it against, but the speed is definitely not low on this blade. Again, it says something about the design, the fact that it is doing something. It's not total snake oil. So I've kind of gone over everything. Oh yeah, the grip. The grip is more than a tri-blade. The grip and overall flight feel and locked in control feel is a little bit more than a tri-blade. It is not as much as a quad blade. So I think I've kind of set this in your mind a little bit. Compared to a tri-blade or a quad blade, this blade is more efficient than a quad blade, absolutely. Faster than a quad blade, absolutely. Less efficient than a tri-blade, definitely. But depending on the motor KV, that may not be true. If the motor KV is correct, if the overall RPM is correct, you could just knock down your max throttle limit, but it's not going to be quite the same. But if you keep it within the appropriate throttle range, the efficiency of this blade could be significantly more than a tri-blade. Not really an area of huge interest to me because I would prefer a blade that has better response, and it doesn't really matter. Let's move on. So the efficiency could be better than a tri-blade if your throttle range is appropriate, if the RPM range is appropriate. The cruising speed is going to be comparable or better than a tri-blade. And the noise is much louder than a quad blade. If you want a quiet 5-inch quad, fly a 6-blade. HQ makes one. It's very quiet and very slow and very inefficient. So it is an interesting blade for sure. Would I use this particular blade? No. The durability is way too low. The overall throttle onset is too aggressive in my opinion and for my taste. This blade is so freaking aggressive and has so much blade area to it that as soon as you touch the throttle, that power just pours on really fast. And that's why I popped up into the trees so quickly. I think that they definitely need to deal with that. However, this blade is going to come out, everyone's going to test it, everyone's going to try it, everyone's going to have their opinion of it, and based on how it does and the feedback, they may or may not iterate on it. Now, I have some ideas about this blade and some things that came to mind when I tested it a bit and may or may not be interesting, maybe it is. So I personally think that this blade tip is probably not doing a whole lot. I think that the blade tip is based on the RPM that these things spin, is very unlikely that you're getting air go through this blade and probably come out the back. Remember I said water is more easy to manage than air because it kind of behaves a little bit more reasonably. The two are very similar, but air is a little more compressible, a little bit more finicky, much less viscous. So it's just a little bit more funny. So I don't think it's going to be the same, but it's similar-ish. In my opinion, I think it's very likely that this blade tip is not actually helping. I think it's hurting. I think you're just getting a big wake of garbage coming off the end of this blade tip. And that's just my sensation. And the last thing I'm going to do in this video, because I only have this one set of blades left, is I'm actually going to clip the ends off and I'm going to fly it and see how it is compared to just the regular ring. So that's interesting because I think that a lot of the reason why this blade performs the way it does is because you have two blades in succession, one after each other. And I think that having one blade in the wake of the next is doing something with respect to the way the air is being processed. It's just a vague theory. I can't really support it a whole lot. I have some weird thoughts in my mind, but I have a feeling that if they just clip the blade end, finished the blade tips in a normal blade, kept the blade shape in this shape, I think they would see actually more improvements in some way. We'll see if I'm wrong at the very end when I clip these blades, but I think it's a very interesting idea. Regardless of that, they definitely need to make it more shallow. Absolutely, it's got to be more shallow. This is not going to work out for the RPMs that we're used to, for the motors that we're all typically used to, and the overall response of the blade is not high enough for all of us to be really happy. I think some people will be fine with it, but a lot of people that are looking for a performance blade are not going to be quite as satisfied with this blade. So that's all I have for you about this prop. I hope 18 minutes of talking was sufficient. I think it's a super, super interesting blade. I think the donut name is appropriate. I'm a little bit ashamed that I recommended it and they actually took me up on that recommendation and used it, but hey, it's going to be remembered, and I hope it's remembered well because it's a super interesting direction for propellers to take. I don't know if it's ever going to turn into something that we are all going to prefer in place of a tri-blade, but I would say that this is an appropriate option over a quad blade, and there might be some very real direction for it to go in with a little bit more development. Another thing I'll note is that there have been blades that are similar to this, namely the Dragonfly from APC that came out a while ago that had a very interesting noise profile, but that was kind of before we knew enough about propellers to understand what we were looking at and what we were dealing with. I think that if they were to cut the ends and finish the end blade tips, it's going to be similar to that a little bit, but having the blades in this configuration and this shape is going to give us a different kind of a quality. Another thing to note is that blades that are forward swept should have better noise profiles because the tip of the blade it's complicated. But one of the issues that I might run into when I clip the ends here is that the trailing blade here, because it's forward swept, it might flutter in the air because there's no support for the blade tip. When you have a blade tip that's kind of trailing down the back here, it's kind of dragging in the air. So it's naturally going to be more stable than a blade that is kind of pushing into the air and the blade tip can flutter. So we'll see what happens. Let's see if we can do this relatively evenly. I'm doing probably a pretty poor job of this. Oh, that one's probably really bad. Really relying on software filters here. I don't even know if this thing's gonna fly. Alright. It's definitely louder. Not much though. Final thoughts on the way home. So first of all, when you clip the ends of these blades, the prop becomes somewhat similar to the, I think, like 6-year-old APC Dragonfly prop. And that prop had a similar structure with the blades kind of quad blade with the blades closer together, but APC makes props for planes, so the blades are very thick and heavy and they don't really assimilate to a multi-rotor as nicely, so it's very difficult to understand what was going on back then. That being said, it did sound distinctly different and it did have a kind of broader auditory note. And with respect to the sound, because I know that's what everybody wants to focus on, it's not any quieter, but it's easier to lose the sound of the multi-rotor if you fly it far away. So as an example, if I'm walking around town and I randomly hear a multi-rotor, because I've heard it many times, I'll immediately turn my head because I know exactly what it is, I know exactly what I'm looking for, and it's distinct to me. It's very easy for me to not recognize that this noise is a multi-rotor, and it's much easier for the human ear to just kind of not notice. But it's definitely not quieter. With respect to the clipped blade ends, I'm really surprised that it resulted in what seemed like higher efficiency. Now, I did clip the ends off, so the blade did become a little shorter, but I did also increase the number of draggy trailing tips, and it's just like a blunt square tip. So it should become less efficient, but I was finding that I was getting less battery alarms, and the overall craft was performing way better, overall. Right off the bat, immediately as I took off, I could tell there was much better response. Throttle feel was way better. Everything about it was better feeling. It's just interesting that it turned out that way, because I think there is something going on with the way the trailing blade passes through the wake of the blade in front of it, which is resulting in this potentially improved efficiency. Still high speed. Quad blades are slow. This was not slow. This is still a high speed blade. Something's going on there. I really hope that they clip the ends, finish the ends, and try to just lower the pitch a bit, just even out and lower the pitch a bit, and I think that might be really interesting. Something else to note about these toroidal props or whatnot, I think they might function a little bit better when they're moving perpendicular to the flow of air, and I think that's also another reason why the boat propeller functions so well in water, because not only does water not compress, but the flow is perpendicular to the prop's action, so it's going to have an easier time dealing with all that. However, I don't know if we really care about that, but I think that might help the situation overall. It's a very interesting propeller. I definitely recommend picking it up. Give it a try, and also floss your teeth. Bye-bye.